Okay, just with this mic? Okay, thanks. Well, while Mike is away for the next couple of weeks, we will sort of have an impromptu two-week series in the book of Genesis. The lectionary brings us to several chapters from the book of Genesis over this period of weeks. And Bucky and I both felt drawn to these passages in the days to come. Today we'll be looking at, and actually next week too, how God established a chosen priestly kingdom for us through the person of Abraham and his wife Sarah. We're a Christian church in the 21st century, and we claim our the life and ministry of Jesus Christ as the example for how God moves in the world. But in truth, God's work of redemption began long before the stories that we tell of Jesus. So these stories are our stories as well, and they're often messy. Now, we Methodists believe that Scripture is only rightly interpreted in community, and by that I mean that no one person has the final authority on how to receive a word from God and interpret it for a community. We believe that we each bring our own experiences, our own tradition that we receive from the church, our own revelation from God in certain ways to help us understand a text. So today I'm going to invite you into a conversation about the 21st chapter of Genesis, the story of Abraham's first son, Ishmael, and his mother, Hagar. This is a challenging story, so we won't have all the answers. We'll leave lots of questions unanswered. In fact, people have been trying to answer questions about this passage for thousands of years, so I don't think we'll solve it today. But the Jewish community had a tradition of rabbis receiving these difficult stories and teaching them to the community in the context of a story. So they would tell a story that sort of filled in the gaps, and over time, those stories became the tradition of how that community interpreted Scripture. It's not unlike what we do in preaching in our tradition as well, but we'll take our own turn at that today. Now, first, a little bit of context, because this story begins before this chapter today, and it covers lots and lots of ground. Father Abraham was a descendant of Noah, who married Sarai. And the one way that Sarai, who becomes Sarah, is identified to us is that she's not able to have children, which in that time was really a very difficult thing for a family, because inheritance was passed through the firstborn child, the firstborn son of a father. And so in Genesis 12, when Abraham was 75 years old, God called him, and God said, "Leave your land, your family, and your father's household for the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation and will bless you. I will make your name respected, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Those who curse you I will curse. All the families of the earth will be blessed because of you." So Abraham left, and he took Sarai and all of his household. He took his nephew Lot and all of Lot's household into the desert. And they were there for a long time, and a lot of stuff happens that we won't talk about today for the sake of time. But they both, through the course of time, became wealthy. And Abraham and Lot had these enormous households with lots of wealth, lots of livestock. And so the land could not support both of them. So they decided to separate, and they each settled in different parts of the same region. And through the course of conflict, Lot got in trouble. Abraham saves Lot from those who would try to overtake him and take his wealth. And God visits Abraham again, and God says in the 15th chapter of Genesis, "Do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your protector. Your reward will be very great. Your heir will be your biological child. Look up at the sky and count the stars. This is how many children you will have." So twice God has visited and made a promise to Abraham. Now the difficulty is, remember, that Sarai, could not bear children. And so they're on up in age. The first visit from God came at age 75, and as Abraham approached 100, Sarah became impatient, and she did not believe naturally that God's promise would be fulfilled in her lifetime. So she decided to take matters into her own hands, and she took her servant Hagar, an Egyptian servant from her household, and gave her to Abraham as his wife. Her hope was that Abraham would have an heir through Hagar, and Sarah would have a son. And so Hagar becomes Abraham's wife. She becomes pregnant. And Sarah became jealous. As Hagar became pregnant, she no longer respected Sarah, and Sarah asked Abraham, I can't deal with this. And Abraham said, she's your servant, do what you will. So Sarah sends Hagar into the desert. And as Hagar is there in her grief, she is visited by a messenger of God. And the messenger says, go back to Sarah and make peace, because you will bear a son who is to be Abraham's son. And so she goes back. She has a son who Abraham names Ishmael, which means God hears. Now, when Abraham was 99 years old, Ishmael was already born. Abraham was 99 years old. He was visited again by the Lord, and the Lord changed his name from Abram to Abraham, which means ancestor of a multitude or something of that sort. So he changed his name to Abraham, changed Sarah's name from Sarai to Sarah, and promised that Sarah would be the one who would bear him a son. And God promised to set up a covenant through Abraham's son, who he would name Isaac. And Abraham already had a son, so he asked God to accept Ishmael. And God says in Genesis 17, as for Ishmael, I have heard your request. I will bless him and make him fertile and give him many, many descendants. He will be the ancestor of 12 tribal leaders, and I will make a great nation of him. But I will set up my covenant with Isaac, who will be born to Sarah this time next year. So this time, the next year, Isaac is indeed born to Sarah, and Father Abraham has 2 sons. And so begins our story for today. Listen for the word of God. The boy, Isaac, grew and stopped nursing. And on the day he stopped nursing, Abraham prepared a huge banquet. Sarah saw Hagar's son laughing, the one Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham, which would be Ishmael. So she said to Abraham, send this servant away with her son. This servant's son won't share the inheritance with my son Isaac. This upset Abraham terribly because the boy was his son. God said to Abraham, don't be upset about the boy and your servant. Do everything Sarah tells you to do, because your descendants will be traced through Isaac. But I will make of your servant's son a great nation too, because he is also your descendant. Abraham got up early in the morning, took some bread and a flask of water, and gave it to Hagar. He put the boy in her shoulder sling and sent her away. And she left and wandered through the desert near Beersheba. Finally, the water in the flask ran out, and she put the boy down under one of the desert shrubs. And she walked away from him about as far as a bow shot and sat down, telling herself, I can't bear to see the boy die. And she sat at a distance, cried out in grief, and wept. God heard the boy's cries, and God's messenger called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, Hagar, what is wrong? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy. Get up, pick up the boy and take him by the hand, because I will make of him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well. She went over, filled the water flask, and gave the boy a drink. God remained with the boy. He grew up, lived in the desert, and became an expert archer. He lived in the Paran desert, and his mother found him an Egyptian wife. You know, when I go back and read these stories, it's sort of like doing a genealogy project and being a little bit ashamed about what you find in your past, you know. It's really, really messy. Because God's promise comes to us through Isaac, I think we often sort of pass over this story, because especially of what Bucky will preach about next week, the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, which is much more familiar to us. But I think if we just skip it over and treat this story as a diversion, we miss an important insight into the nature of God. Isaac's birth was the fulfillment of a promise, but it presents a problem because Abraham had 2 sons, and Abraham's inheritance was due only to the first son. But both Ishmael and Isaac are children of promise, because God had made a promise to Hagar to be with Ishmael, and God had made a promise to Abraham to make a covenant through Isaac. So it's difficult to understand, since they're both children of promise, how God and Sarah and Abraham could act in the way they do in this story. It's difficult for me anyway, because Abraham had raised Ishmael as his son. If you do the math on when Ishmael was born, he would have been about 15 years old at the time that this took place. And there's a little incongruency because the story makes it sound like Ishmael's a baby. He puts Ishmael in Hagar's shoulder sling, right? But in reality, Ishmael would have been with the family about 15 years. And they were close to one another. Abraham had taught him how to hunt. Obviously, he was an archer already. He had taught him to do the things necessary to take care of the family, and certainly would have taught him the ways of God. They were close as father and son. And on top of that, Sarah had what she had hoped for when she gave Hagar to Abraham in the first place. She had a son. She had an heir for Abraham. Hagar had been told in the desert of God's promise for Ishmael, that he would be the father of a great nation. Hagar had a bright future as well. But something happened on the day that Isaac stopped nursing. In those days, making it through the first few months of infancy was the most vulnerable time in the life of a child. And so once a child had been weaned and was no longer needed to nurse from the mother, it was a day of great celebration because the child was past the most difficult years. And so when Isaac was weaned, Abraham threw a great feast. And something happened at the feast, and nobody really knows what it is, but lots of the Jewish midrash that I talked about centers around the phrase, Sarah saw Hagar's son laughing. There's a lot of disagreement about the Hebrew word that is translated here, laughing. Sometimes it's translated playing. Some translations will say mocking, but those are all interpretations. Nobody knows exactly what the word means. So who knows exactly what happened? But somehow Sarah became jealous, and she demands that Abraham sends him away. And of course, as we read, Abraham was very upset because the idea of losing his son was terrible. And I'm sure to Abraham's surprise, when God got involved, he was on Sarah's side. Although Sarah's motives were harsh, I think her plan was clearly in line with God's will for Abraham's descendants, to make a covenant through Isaac and not Ishmael. So of all things, Abraham gives them one flask of water and a little bread and sends them off into the desert. And I have to wonder why a rich man would give such a meager ration. Some Jewish scholars think that Abraham expected them only to go a short distance, just a few miles away to another village where he would establish a household for them. Some suggest that maybe Hagar lost her way in a storm in the desert and wandered. Others suggest that maybe she was angry and that she was willing to let Ishmael die as an act of revenge. Who knows? But while they were in the desert, they weren't alone. God was watching. God heard the cries of the boy. And through a messenger, he said, Hagar, what's wrong? Don't be afraid. God has heard the boy's cries over there. Get up, pick up the boy, and take him by the hand, because I will make of him a great nation. And God opens her eyes, and she sees a well and gives him a drink. Now, it's interesting, if you read further on in Genesis, when Abraham dies and is buried, of all the descendants of Abraham, Ishmael and Isaac, the two sons, are the ones who are there at the burial. So it makes you think that there must have been some sort of relationship after this point. Some suggest that Abraham, after Sarah's death, Abraham remarried Hagar. But either way, clearly God has established two lines of descendants through Abraham, and God chooses the descendants of Isaac to make a covenant. Now, I think for the most part, if you think about this at all like I do, our modern ears, when we hear the story, we empathize with Abraham, who was being asked to give away a son and a wife. And for me, the idea that God would choose one line of a descendant over another doesn't quite square with my cultural frame, in which we all value fairness and egalitarianism and taking care of each other equally. But really, this is a pretty common depiction of how God moves in the Old Testament, making choices, making covenant. And often you see that those with whom a covenant is made are held to really high standards. They're set apart, as we read, to be a blessing, to be a priestly kingdom. So they're set to high standards and often face very difficult trials. And I think for Abraham, certainly, being called to dismiss his first son is a difficult trial. And it must have been as bad as the story we'll hear next week when God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And if you know the story, it doesn't quite take shape that way, but it's in a way a test of Abraham's faithfulness. And in fact, those two stories, we could call this the sacrifice of Ishmael as he's sent into the desert, and the sacrifice of Isaac, which we hear next week, share a really similar framework. Because Abraham both times rises early in the morning, he gathers a ration of food, and in the midst of the most troubling part of the story, when Hagar and Ishmael were near the point of death, when Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac, God intervenes and he opens eyes. So Hagar sees a well and she gets a drink for Ishmael. So Abraham sees a ram stuck in a bush to offer as a sacrifice. And I have to think that these two stories must be divinely important, equal parts in God's plan for Abraham. Well, so as we hear this story in the 21st century, a story that's so far from our experience, what difference does it make for us? How does it matter? Well, first of all, to me, I think this story shows that God's nature is one of goodness and mercy. We know from our experience how God is revealed in the life and ministry of Jesus. We have a strong understanding of God as compassionate and merciful. But even in this episode that seems so harsh, God's presence with Hagar and Ishmael confirm that mercy and compassion and presence are all part of God's nature and are present in all of God's activity in the Old Testament. God hears the cry of the needy. Second, this story confirms for us that God does not perfect people before God puts them to use, before God calls them. I, for one, am thankful for that. I think God shows again and again that God chooses to use the people who are present in the moment, the people who are made available, and gives them what they need to be useful. And I think that's the way it is with communities of faith. If anybody watched our general conference from a couple of years ago, I watched all of it on the live stream and felt like at the end I'd wasted a lot of time because it seemed like not much happened, and it certainly was imperfect. And yet, people who are called to service in the life of our denomination are changing lives every day all over the world through acts of compassion abroad and at home. And on a smaller scale, that happens in this place every week as we do what we can to meet the needs of people in our community. And the truth is, it doesn't only happen in church. Sometimes we feel like it has to be between the walls here if it's going to happen, but that's not necessarily true. While I was in between church appointments last year, I spent a few months working at Publix, my neighborhood Publix in the produce department, and it was awesome. It was awesome. It was a period of time where nobody knew that I was a clergy person. Nobody cared what I had done before. I did my job, and I went home, and I didn't worry about it after that, and I thought, I could get used to this. This is pretty great. And yet, that experience, more than anything else in my life, confirmed that indeed God had placed a call on my spirit, because I began to see how day to day, in these ordinary interactions with people, God provided opportunities to offer compassion, to listen. And I watched how a person who chooses to live out their faith, regardless of their occupation, can have a profound impact on the lives of other people. The produce manager should have been called produce manager / pastor, because he was a deeply devoted Christian man and totally changed the lives of the people who worked in his department. I've never seen anything quite like it. And I learned while I was there how a tomato can be a means of grace. My job for those few months was to close the department down on Friday nights. Sometimes Friday nights was consistent, but other nights as well. But on a Friday night, it was late, and I was the only one there. I was just about the only one on that side of the store, and I saw an older man come in and began to walk through picking up fruit, and he really focused on the tomatoes, and he picked up the tomatoes, and I walked by and spoke and asked if he needed any help, and he said no thanks, and I kept watching as he went from tomato to tomato, and finally he was standing at the end of an end cap, and he had 3 tomatoes in his hands, just looking and I went over and I made some kind of joke about how terrible supermarket tomatoes were. I knew it was hard to buy, and we entered into this conversation where he had recently lost his wife, who was the shopper, who was the cook, and he didn't have family in Nashville. He was healthy enough to live alone, so he was learning to take care of himself. And so we spent half an hour walking through the department, talking about the fruit and talking about other things. And through a simple interaction, I was able to help him know which tomatoes not to buy. If you want to buy a supermarket tomato, buy a Tasty Lee. That's the only one that's any good. And I sent him home with a couple of Tasty Lees, and then sent him to a neighborhood stand that I knew of down the road to get some local tomatoes. But I also let him know that he wasn't alone, right? That we're all sort of in this together. And I'm really thankful for that. God was with that man, is with that man, just as God was with Ishmael. Now, third, I'll say that I think the story in the context of God's choosing Isaac shows that being chosen doesn't entitle you to be the only person to enjoy the presence and the mercy of God. In the midst of the desert, God was with the one who had been dismissed. God was with the ones who were outcast. And John Wesley even commented on this in his notes on the Old Testament, which surprised me a bit. And he said about this verse in particular, the casting out of Ishmael was not his ruin. He shall be a nation because he is thy seed, Abraham's seed. We are not sure that it was his eternal ruin, Ishmael's eternal ruin. It is presumption to say that all these who are left out of the external dispensation of God's covenant, all those who are the descendants of Isaac with whom God made a plain covenant. It is presumption to say that all these who are left out of the external dispensation of God's covenant are excluded from all his mercies. Those may be saved who are not thus honored. And this means that we should rejoice that God's acts of salvation and mercy are not confined to God's chosen community, but take place in even the most God-forsaken parts of the world. And even, as this story shows us, among people who seem to be excluded from the people of God. It doesn't seem honest to talk about this story without saying that Ishmael is the way that the Muslim faith traces its connection to Abraham. So Muslims are the spiritual descendants of Ishmael, just as we are the spiritual descendants of Isaac. That means about 1 billion Muslim souls, 85% of whom live outside the Middle East, even though that's the region that makes the most news. All descendants of God's promise to Ishmael. Now, combined with the various expressions of Christianity across the world, that's, 3.5 billion children of promise. Children of promise to Isaac, children of promise to Ishmael. And it grieves me that our human imperfection that's too often expressed in fear and in hate, often rightfully so, is driven by the notion that God is something that we can somehow control, that by having the right answers, that by learning to say the right things, we can claim God's prerogative. I think we serve a creator God who finds ways to do the work of redemption, sometimes in spite of us. And finally, the selection of Isaac reminds us that how we treat the Ishmaels of the world is deeply important. Abraham and Isaac were chosen, as we heard, blessed to be a blessing. They were chosen so the world could be blessed through them. And Ishmael and Hagar, in this context, are the poster children for the outcast, for the refugee of the world. And we, who are the spiritual descendants of Isaac, are called to be present with those who suffer, just as God was present with Ishmael and Hagar in the desert, to hold them up and to help them become whole. And this story reminds me that I'm very grateful to have had a few years to work with the English as a second language program at Hillcrest United Methodist, which was my appointment before I came here. The ministry started as a way for that church to try to reach a neighborhood that had changed, that had become largely Hispanic and Spanish-speaking. And over time, it became less Spanish-speaking, and the Catholic Charities program began to settle refugees from all over the world into that part of the city. And so it became a partnership between Catholic Charities and Hillcrest United Methodist that 3 days a week, dozens of students from all over the world come into the church building to learn English so that they can try to survive in the United States. And I'm struck by an image that I saw one day as the demographics of that group began to change from being exclusively Hispanic to almost non-Hispanic completely. We walked out to go to lunch with the staff one day, and there was a group of Christian women from the refugees while they were on break in the fellowship hall talking about the Bible. And as we walked out the door, there was a Muslim man kneeling down in the grass to pray, and a Hindu in the grass on the other side, all finding a place of compassion. That's an image that sticks with me. And so it reminds me, and this story reminds me, that God's mercy is wide, God's mercy is deep, God's mercy is beyond us. God sees, God hears, and God saves. So thanks be to God. Amen.